super excited to introduce him and have him talk about advanced experimentation from a kind of technical lens. So
thank you very
take
much,
it away.
Holly. Much appreciated. Alrighty, so today we're going to talk about, as Holly said, I suppose, advanced experimentation. We're going to cover off on a range of different topics. These topics all predominantly relate to questions posed frequently by technical support. So I suppose Manny, who some of you might have dealt with in the past via Optimize the X, sort of answers tickets with regards to different tech questions that come up. So we've really tried to tailor this presentation in such a way that it answers the most common, deepest technical stuff that comes up with Optimizely on a regular basis. So that's everything from data problems, data discrepancies. I can see there's Toby in the back there is having a chuckle because probably a lot of the tickets have come from him. And overcoming common challenges faced operationally, such as regular expressions, cross-domain Optimizely, optimize extensions, flickering, things of that nature. I guess a lot of today, and no criticism whatsoever, has been about strategy and has been about the marketing technology stack and has been about CRO ideation and strategy. And all of these things are important. But I think sometimes, I guess, when it comes to really showing leadership, one way of doing that is rolling up the sleeves and getting it done. So our philosophy at Web Marketing Roi is kind of the GSD philosophy, which can either be get stuff done or the less profane version, which is what we're really saying by that is if you have the right technical skills to get the stuff done, you can jump into Optimizely, you should be able to jump into whatever testing tool you're using and actually maybe get a test launched and actually do some stuff. And that's a great way of getting traction. Ultimately, with all these things, it's about momentum. Having the perfect test, yes, that's great, but ultimately it's probably better to have a high velocity and be trying to test as much as you can than necessarily trying to get the perfect test and get the perfect code. So get you done. This Dilbert comic here probably resembles many conversations I've had with many execs, which is on the left-hand side, we've got, earlier today, we had Simon from the Luminary talk about Frank. You could maybe picture the individual on the left-hand side as Frank, perhaps. And he says, let's use the CRS database to size the market. To which Dilbert says, well, that data is fundamentally wrong. It's not correct. And then next, the Frank individual says, well, okay, let's use another database. Let's use another data set. To which then Dilbert says, well, that data's also wrong. And then Frank, or the hippo, or whatever you want to call him, says, well, okay, in that case, let's see about maybe multiplying it or doubling it or something of the sort. To which the answer is, well, yeah, sure, we can do that. The point of this comic is that if your underlying data is broken or incorrect, then any assumptions or insights you have based upon that are going to be meaningless completely. They're going to be incorrect. Data as a whole costs the US, according to a recent Harvard Business Review study, $3 trillion a year. So this is a big problem. And the idea of data is thrown around a lot, but we're going to talk today about the context of data in terms of Optimizely. So we're going to talk about GA data, we're going to talk about Optimizely data, and how to make sure it's actually correct. Okay, so all about the data. How do we make this work? We're going to talk about the misconceptions. We're going to talk about some of the implementation stuff, and we're going to talk about some of the most critical issues. The first thing to remember and to keep in mind is that according to a recent study by eConsultancy, 73% of Google Analytics implementations were completely buggered, like wrong altogether, which is to say that your data, there's a very, very good chance for most people in the room, probably 73% of you, your GA data is just wrong, full stop. And when we say wrong, we mean session referrals, we mean incorrect revenue, incorrect traffic numbers, and there's a whole range of reasons for this. Now, this presents a big problem because if we're relying upon the Optimizely and GA integration to be able to send data from Optimizely to GA, and we're therefore reporting that dimension, well, everything we look at is going to be incorrect. So the solution to this problem is quite simple. Fix your implementation, and there's a way to do that. Has anyone in the room experienced or gone through a GA audit by show of hands? Yep, a few of you. And a bunch of work related to that? Yeah. Did you see things like weird revenue numbers or filtering or anything like that? All of the above? Who hasn't ever gone through a GA audit? Yeah, probably should. Sorry. So this is a bit of a, I suppose you could say, shameless self-promotion, but there's a few different solutions here. So one, you can throw money at the problem. So you can go and find any provider who will maybe give you like a Google Analytics audit, which is like a scope of work that they'll go through, run a checklist, go through each part of your implementation, make sure there's no problems with your GA implementation. They'll apply filters, they'll identify problems. Might cost you maybe $2,000, $3,000. We do this, there are other companies that do this, Data Runs Deep, Sense Data Lab. You can also do like a DIY checklist. So if you're budget conscious and you don't have money to throw at the problem, you can just simply jump on any of the resources you see here, work through the checklist, maybe spend 40 hours on the problem or more, and hopefully you'll be able to go through the fairly arduous process of identifying all of the potential GA implementation issues. And therefore, your data that underlies Optimizely when you're reviewing your experiment results will be more accurate. Make sense? One of the common questions that comes up and that Manny probably gets frustrated by every day is this kind of measurement problem. So a lot of questions come up about, well, okay, I'm analyzing my experiment results. Why don't they stack up to what I'm seeing in this dashboard over here, or in Snowplow, or in this particular BI tool, or this particular tool? And often it comes back to a simple example of apples and oranges. So if you're not comparing the same thing, and you've got different definitions for that, then you're not going to see the same numbers. You're not actually comparing apples and oranges. They're different, fundamentally. What do we mean by that? Well, let's take the example of Google Analytics again. So this idea of Google Analytics, when we have a session timeout in GA, by default, it's 30 minutes long, which is entirely different to the way that Optimizely measures the idea or the notion of a session or a user. So when Optimizely thinks about a user, it does it by what's called an Optimizely end user ID, which is a cookie that expires 10 years after expiry. So simple example, let's say we open an incognito window when we come to the website, then we're one visitation. If we close that incognito window and then we come back, we're then a second visitation because we've got a new cookie. However, if we don't change devices or change browsers, and we stay on the same device or same browser, then we'll forever be that one user in the eyes of Optimizely, which is entirely different to how GA works. So again, this is an example of fundamental differences. Who has done some research or analysis into the new impressions model, or has questions about the impressions model that's now part of Optimizely by default? Less of you than I thought. Who, by a show of hands, is using Optimizely currently, out of curiosity? Okay. And how many are using Adobe Target? Okay. And how many are using, say, VWO? How many on Google Optimize? Okay, interesting. So the impressions model in Optimizely works probably a bit differently to some of the other tools you might have played with in the past. So this is a newer model. And basically, the way it works is essentially there's this concept in Optimizely under the hood called a decision. And this is fundamentally required for all of the Optimizely X personalization suite and everything else that Optimizely can do. And it's, without getting too technical, if that's possible, it's essentially an XML HTTP request that happens between the browser and the website, the server. And every time there's one of those gets fired, this is what's tied to the idea of an impression. So if you've ever gotten confused about what this means and how this has implications, any of the front-end developers in the room can simply just fire up Google Chrome and go to like network, console, have a look. You'll see the decisions actually getting fired. And if you watch those and count those, that's an impression. So that's an important thing to know. Has anyone in the room written any SQL before, out of curiosity? Yeah, okay, cool. So that'll mean something to two of you in the room. So up here we have just an example of, this comes from actually something from the SF team. Evan Weiss is really great there. Just about how some of this works in terms of deduplication behind the scenes. I thought it was pretty cool. Okay, so hopefully everybody has seen this before. This is an example of a Optimizely results screen. And I want to talk through a little bit about some of the problems that can occur with a results screen in Optimizely. So you look at this kind of picture and it shows a bunch of data, but sometimes it's very overwhelming, and sometimes you're not even sure what it means or if it's accurate or inaccurate. Well, there's a very, very large number of possible reasons for why you can see stuff not appearing as it should in that results screen. The first thing to keep in mind is pages. So anytime we're setting up, and this is, again, distinct from the way things happen in Adobe Target or Google Optimize or VWO, anytime in Optimizely you are creating basically a bucket that will activate anytime you want to have essentially a campaign occur. So that could be for one page, a singular page, or it could be for a collection of pages. So in the e-commerce context, you can, for example, in Optimizely create this idea of a product detail page if you're an e-commerce company. What this means is that it's much easier to experiment on categories of pages rather than just singular pages. You can get more advanced too. One of the nice things about Optimizely is it handles very elegantly single-page applications. So if any of you in the room have ever had to deal with React, Angular, sign-up flows, crazy kind of conditional activation type stuff, this is one thing that I suppose we go very, very, very deep in. We've had to deal with it quite a few times. As distinct, for example, from Adobe Target, if I can talk about other vendors for a minute, one of our frustrations of working with that particular tool is that every time you want to do, for example, a sort of like a single-page application update, essentially, to be able to trigger a particular moment in time, like activate a campaign basically as a result of step 2 in a funnel, you might have to fire that from some kind of third-party tool, tag management or something like Telium or Google Tag Manager, which is a bit of a nightmare, to be honest, because it means you have to go over to the Telium team and have a chat to them about how things work and make sure they're okay with you pushing something into their tag management, and things start to get very complicated very fast. Optimizely handles this much more elegantly. So there's a thing called a callback function. A callback function is some JavaScript that you write and you hand it over to Optimizely, and that will basically run every time a snippet runs. So you can set this up in such a way by working with some smart front-end developers if you've got some resources internally, where basically you can go, okay, anytime we're at this second step of the funnel and we see this kind of element in the DOM appear, then we can go, okay, we're going to actually activate this particular step of the funnel. This is so much more powerful because it gives you velocity and autonomy to be able to do stuff without having to go and chat to the GTM team or the Telium team every time. But the important thing to remember is you really want to make sure all your pages are activating correctly. If they're not, then you're going to have problems. So simple example, this is how you actually create a page in Optimizely, and in this particular case, we've got example.com. Now, we give it a substring match, or we can have a simple match, or we can have a regular expression. Now, in this case, this would have the slightly unintended consequence of triggering for every single page on example.com, with the one exception of example.com/ignore_this_page on a simple match basis with possible query strings. So if you're confused by that, that's because it is indeed confusing. And this is where people go wrong. So you have to be very, very careful about your kind of setup. And if you get something off a little bit, then what you'll find is that you have pages misactivating. And then to go back to the screen before, you see these numbers won't look like they should. They'll be off. They'll be incorrect. So again, fundamentally, you might have a data problem. Where this can also come up is with audience conditions. So this is both one of our favorite and sort of most disliked features of Optimizely. It is super, super powerful, but sometimes technical power gives you the ability to hang yourself if you're not careful too. It allows you to create basically some custom JavaScript that can basically trigger any audience for any reason you like. Now this is very, very useful. It's used to power personalization. It's used to power behavioral data. You can use it for a variety of purposes. You can query the data layer. You can query GTM, Telium, whatever you like. However, if there is one little bug here in this code, you can accidentally get yourself a situation where your audience might be misfiring when it shouldn't be. So, for example, this is a situation where what we're doing is we're checking the user agent and we're making sure it matches the following string, which is Mozilla, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. It's a particular version of Mozilla. Now, if for argument's sake, a developer hit the wrong key and put something in here incorrectly, you could have a situation where your audiences are misfiring. So you need to be kind of careful about that. If your audience is misfiring, again, going back to the problem before, you might not see the experiment looking like you should. So the moral of the story here is you really need to make sure everything is QA'd properly. And there's nothing sexy about this whatsoever, but make a spreadsheet and actually go through pages, events, campaigns, and audiences, and actually list each of your audiences, list each of your pages, each of your campaigns, and each of your events, and make sure they're actually fired at the times they should be fired and not when they shouldn't be. If that sounds like hard work, again, that's because it is. And if you can't be bothered with that, the other possibility is just throw some money at the problem. So Optimizely have an official body of work they call the Optimize the Accelerate program. It's something you can chat to Holly about, and Holly can probably even talk you through it if you like. It's like an 8 to 12 week scope of work that's delivered by solutions partners, some of whom you see here. And basically what it allows you to do is it includes a full QA of all of your events, pages, URLs, audiences QA, and so on, and some other stuff. There's some of the clients in Australia who have gone through this process, but there's tons internationally as well. So that's kind of the throw the money at the problem, or if you want the DIY solution, go through, create a Google Doc, share it with the team, make sure each is listed, and actually go through the process of actually QAing these. Who has ever had to create a QA campaign in Optimizely for like an event, for instance? Yeah, okay, one person. So we talked earlier today about this like skills problem in Australia. Without pointing out, I mean, there's obviously a huge problem if we all want to get better at CRO and we all want to do this faster and more efficiently. And a fundamental skill set is being able to QA to make sure our events are actually firing correctly and making sure our testing tool is working. But it's a skill set that is super rare, as you can see in this room. So the good news is that there's a ton of resources out there to make this stuff much easier, and there's a ton of really, really, really great talent in this conference today, great solutions partners. I also highly recommend the developer certification. Okay, let's talk about URLs. So in Optimizely, we've got this idea of a page. And again, pages can have a few different types. We've got regular expressions, we've got simple match, substring match, and exact match are the 4 types. They all mean different things. Simple match means match for that URL and any query string. Exact match means match only that URL and nothing else, no exceptions. A regular expression, which gets messy again, is who's familiar with regular expressions? Has anyone had to write? Okay, quite a few. That's good. Regular expressions, as we'll talk about it shortly, are a way of telling some kind of programming language to interpret string matching, if you will. Then we've got multi-page tests, and then how to actually make Optimizely work cross-domain. One of the problems that comes up a lot with the other testing tools out there is just getting these things to work cross-domain. So you might have different funnels across different pages, you might have different flows from A to B, and you might want to make sure that you're tracking the same user, similar to Google Analytics, across that whole journey, across that whole flow. And there's a way of actually making that work in Optimizely that works quite elegantly, which we'll talk about. So one of the biggest and most common kind of problems with this page matching is just matching too freely. So when we say matching too freely, we mean simply, let's say the example.com, that will match for anything including your domain.com.au example.com, which you might not want it to actually trigger for at all, which is pretty bad. Another one we see a lot is just issues altogether with the regular expressions, which are not the easiest thing in the world to understand, to be honest. This is a cheat sheet, which is sort of some common stuff to do with regular expressions. So, and I don't think anyone actually ever remembers this. I think I first wrote a regular expression when I was like 10 or something like that, but there's no way that I can remember any of this stuff. I can remember maybe a few of the anchors and a few of the character classes, but that's about it, and maybe 1 or 2 of the quantifiers. But the idea is if you're actually working Optimize every day, print this out, go on Google, go to regular expressions cheat sheet, print it out, slap it on your desk, On my GitHub, I've got an example of some common Optimizely X JavaScript APIs. I know Will refers to it, one of our front-end devs. He refers to it on a regular basis when he's building out Optimizely campaigns. And so just make sure you got it next to you, in front of you, and refer back to it. You don't have to memorize this stuff. You just have to be able to get easy access to it. Where this becomes important with regular expressions is if you get one character wrong, literally if you put a $ in the wrong place or if you capitalize your W rather than lowercase your W, that means something entirely different to Optimizely. So again, the governance around this and the code quality around this and making sure you're actually you're doing this stuff in the right way and measuring this stuff properly is super important. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about skills. If you want to run a successful optimization program, nothing about this is sexy, but this is the fundamental nuts and bolts of what it's required to really be able to build out more than 6 campaigns a month at the fundamental level and have a tremendous personalization program. These are the same skills that Cathay Pacific used to make $7.5 million in 4 months, literally. So, reg expressions. There's a website, which is one of my favorite, which is regexr.com. If you want to get good at writing reg expressions, then jump on this website and actually practice. So see if you got it right. There's also a really useful tool in Optimizely itself, which is the URL matching tool, which makes it a little bit easier to kind of get this right and sort of check if you're on the right path or the wrong path or if you've messed it up completely. It's pretty funky. I remember when I was first learning reg expressions, they didn't have like any of this stuff. So you just had to kind of like figure it out yourself, which was a nightmare in Perl. But anyway. So wait for origin sync. Wait for origin sync is the magic function in Optimizely that makes cross-domain Optimizely work. So what it does, it's a bit of a dirty hack, but basically it injects an iframe into your website that allows the Optimizely end user cookie and the Optimizely local storage to jump or skip from basically domain A or subdomain A to subdomain B, which therefore allows it to actually track properly. If you don't have this, then it won't work. In other words, you take this code, you usually copy and paste it from the dev docs, you paste it into your Optimizely project JavaScript, which again is one of our favorite features of Optimizely, and you're off and away. Just to recap, Optimizely's project JavaScript is something, again, that a few of the other tools out there like VWO and Adobe Target simply don't have, which is probably why it's our preferred tool. Project JavaScript is, again, an example of how Optimizely can make from a technical perspective, can make your CRO program a bit more autonomous. So with other testing tools, if you, again, want to get something done, and let's say, for example, you want to create a custom event that will fire anytime something happens because you want to be able to track it as part of a campaign. With Target, for instance, you might have to go and speak to someone from the Telium team or chat to someone in the GTM team or DTM and actually find out, okay, cool, we need to get this new tag pushed, we need to make sure this is fired at the right time, we need to get the event handlers in place. Again, that slows things down, the total cost of ownership gets higher, there's more people. Occasionally we've seen some of our competitors have a situation where to get one test built, they have to go through like 7 different layers of literally individuals, and I see this in organizations too. Remove some of the unnecessary layers if you can, because it generally just adds overhead. One of the biggest things that I remember learning from agile development in IT and software development is the idea of, the on-site developer. So you don't necessarily need to have one person capturing the requirements, another person doing documentation, another person doing this. Where possible, the shorter the path between the customer and the actual person writing the code, the better. And the same is true for Optimizely. The less parties that are involved, if you can get, for example, 1 or 2 key individuals in your team who can come up with ideas for tests and write tests, wow, that's powerful. In the case of one of our senior front-end developers who's sitting in the front today, he does a lot of requirements gathering and also does sort of like a BA type stuff and actually ideation for clients on site. So that, again, with the right skills, with the right training, people can do a few different roles. Therefore, more velocity, reduced TCO, it's a winner. Cool. Wait for origin sync. This is the official Optimizely doc that you see for Wait for Origin Sync. This is from the Optimizely's JavaScript API. So you call a function called push, basically, which is a property of the Optimizely data object. And you give it basically the following property. So you give it type, you tell it to wait for origin sync, and then you give it a list of domains or subdomains where you want this local storage and where you want this cookie to persist to. So in the case here, this local storage and this would basically make cross-domain Optimizely work for optimizely.com and developers.optimizely.com. And if you left this out of your Optimizely's project JavaScript, you would see two people showing up rather than one. So you'd basically have messed it up. You'd mess up your data. Again, it's very important. This can also be used for really interesting personalization use cases too. So we had a case in North America actually where it was an Accelerate where they had just purchased Optimizely X personalization, and they were California's largest skiing resort. And they also owned a bunch of lodging properties. So they owned, for example, a bunch of different, so they did like ski resorts, but they also did like hotels, lodging. And they were different domains, different sites altogether. What they wanted to do was they wanted to have one snippet across all of the different URLs, all the different domains, and actually track the behavioral data on domain, on basically, so like, okay, they're booked for a hotel which we own, which is on hotel.com. And then they've come back to skiingresort.com, which was actually Mammoth Mountain, and they're booked. So by using Wait for Origin Sync, we're able to make sure that we track the user as one person, cross-journey from domain A to domain B to domain C, all the way through, and then expose that data as an audience, and then create a personalization campaign in Optimizely that actually worked in that manner, which was pretty cool. Make sense? If not, the dev docs are very, very good, so you can have a look through there too. Okay, campaign development. Who has had to develop a campaign in Optimizely before? Not too many, okay. So probably most of you are familiar with the idea of the visual editor, I would guess. Most tools, whether it be VWO, whether it be Adobe Target or whatever else, Google Optimize, they tend to have some kind of visual editor. No matter what tool you're using, my professional advice, having been in CRO for quite a few years now, is avoid the visual editor like the plague. It will mess up your website and it will cause more problems than you can. It's not something all the vendors necessarily talk about, but it's the truth. And the reason I say that is it's not anyone's fault. WYSIWYG editors just do a very, very bad job of writing code. It's not the job of WYSIWYG editors have always been pretty bad. Dreamweaver's been a nightmare for years, front page, all these kinds of things. Anytime you're using a visual editor to create JavaScript code, chances are your JavaScript code's not going to be very good. And that's going to then potentially cause problems with your site as a whole. So our advice is whenever you're developing campaigns or tests, in whatever testing tool it might be, make sure that you're doing it in JavaScript, ideally native JavaScript, and make sure you're doing it with somebody who knows what they're doing in terms of front-end development. Ideally, who's also certified in that particular testing tool. I don't like visual editors at all. So one of our favorite features of Optimizely X in the newer releases, which is also part of, it came out at the same time Optimizely X personalization came out, is this idea of extensions. And originally it was invented as I suppose to solve a bit of a pain point that the San Franciscan engineering team found, which was that by the nature of personalization, you have more and more concurrently running campaigns going on for a longer period of time. So with testing, you generally start a test, you run the test for a while, you stop running the test, you get a result, and then you move on. With personalization, by nature, you may have tens or hundreds of campaigns forever running, which never stop. And that's the idea of personalization. So when you start having that kind of scale in your testing tool, you start to get into this weird kind of technical architectural challenge, I guess, this front-end challenge, which is like, wait a minute, we've got all this stuff sitting in our snippet, and it's all running, and we need to keep it all live, and it's all kind of awkwardly sitting on this front-end layer, which is not super elegant. So extensions kind of solve this problem, because extensions are a campaign, an object-oriented approach to campaign development. So instead of having one code base for each of your campaigns or each of your tests, you have one extension which might power 100 different campaigns. And then if you find a bug in that one particular code base, you update that one extension, and it pushes out to all the other 100. So it sort of solves that problem. But they can be tricky, and there's a bit to know about them, which we'll talk about. This is not the kind of extensions we're talking about, but this is a cute picture of a dog with some extensions. I think Holly sourced. I quite like it. One thing to note about extensions is that extensions, by definition, are extendable. So this sounds a bit confusing, but what it means is that one of the lesser-known properties of an extension in Optimizely is that you can refer back to the extension as part of the output processing logic of Optimizely. If that sounds, so what that means is you can overwrite the way that an extension works with an extension. So in other words, they're extendable. Now, at first, we didn't actually think very much of this, but this is super powerful because, and we've seen this with a few of our clients, there are a number of clients who are using this for the purpose of doing things like translation. So by default, Optimizely's extensions don't actually allow you to do extensions, don't allow you to do translation. But you can, if you want to, actually overwrite the way that this works by default. So for example, if you want to build out some code in your Optimizely account that basically supports translation, you can, which is pretty powerful. The same is true for any kind of overriding of logic. You can get pretty fancy. You can even do some incredible stuff like with Project JavaScript, we saw a situation where there was a bunch of stuff around preloading of images, almost like a lazy loader, if there's any front-end devs in the room, but it's a discussion another time. Okay, so the key things to know about extensions, the key takeaways are they're templates, they're modular in nature, they have massive performance gains, they're almost like a repository for each of your different campaigns. They function a bit like, you have this one object or this one instance of your code base and it powers X number of campaigns. X can be any number. But when you go about building them, you start to run into all these kind of like challenges, like, well, wait a minute, how far do we want to go with this? Like, do we want to have like 100 input fields, or do we want to have 5? Do we want to have 3? Do we want to have 10? How do we want to go about this? So there's also sometimes a common problem we saw, and this came up a bit with Cathay Pacific in Hong Kong, was their extension showing up or not being accessible. So enable it, disable it, re-enable it, stuff like that. There's a few kind of tricky challenges there that sometimes get a bit of a problem. You have to remember, whenever using extensions, to always enable the extension. Make sure it's in enabled mode and not disabled mode, otherwise you're not going to actually have it show up. And there's some other things here. This is an example of how it might look if you're actually doing the translation stuff. So here, this is basically an example where we're potentially in Project JavaScript, we've added an additional layer. We've extended the way the extensions work. So rather than just have this situation where we can go, okay, headline, we've actually got support for different languages, and we've basically written that on top of Optimizely. So it's almost like creating your own Optimizely plugin to make it do what you want. It's pretty cool. Pretty powerful. Earlier today, and some research I've seen referred to a number of times, talked about the correlation between complexity of campaign based on number of lines of code and win rate, which is something that I've seen time and time again, and something that I've kind of felt intuitively in the industry for probably about 7 years, which is that generally the button color kind of test stuff doesn't generally create massive wins. The massive wins usually come from kind of mastering the tech and having pretty complicated code bases. So if I think about some of our most successful, in terms of revenue uplift, campaigns, they've probably almost always been over at least 100 lines of code, as a general rule of thumb. Equally, they've probably almost always had maybe 5 variations, not just a couple, which we talked about earlier today too. So it's really great to see that data is verifying what we've always kind of felt and always kind of suspected about ideation. Page flashing and page flickering. As you can see here, we've got the flash. So anyone who's done any kind of front-end development or worked with any kind of testing tool in the past has definitely experienced this problem of the page flickering. And all the testing tools have this issue. And it's a constant challenge for any front-end developer to be wrestling with the document object model and the browser in such a way to make sure the thing doesn't flicker when it first loads. Because if it flickers, then users are going to leave the site, they're going to be frustrated, and you're going to poison the whole results of what you're doing, and the whole integrity of it's gone. So how do we try to make sure we don't have flashing or flickering? Well, we need to use the wait for element, which is this, anyway. So there's a thing in Optimizely called the utils library. The utils library is it's like a helper function, a helper library. It contains a bunch of different useful functions. One of the functions is called wait for element. Wait for element it returns an ES6 style promise in native JavaScript that is like an asynchronous approach to basically running some code when something appears on the page. And therefore, less flickering. Who knows what we mean when we say the document object model? Who's ever worked with a document object model before? Yeah, a couple? Okay, we'll actually give an example of what one is shortly. So if you're training your front-end developers, make sure you show them the dev docs on wait for element. Make sure they understand it. Make sure you've got front-end devs on the team who can work with this stuff thoroughly. Make sure you're building this stuff out in ES6, native JavaScript, rather than jQuery, because that just becomes a nightmare otherwise. And if you run into problems, log a ticket with Manny or dev docs. And we'll also talk about asynchronous versus synchronous. jQuery, the bane of my existence, and all of our team. Okay, so the way that jQuery and Optimizely work together has changed a lot in the last couple of years. So in Optimizely Classic, jQuery and Optimizely Classic used to be a fundamental relationship between them where they couldn't be decoupled. Basically, Optimizely Classic was jQuery was a dependency of Optimizely Classic. So it actually needed jQuery to run at a certain version. It's no longer the case. So now you no longer need to have jQuery present if you want Optimizely X to run, which is good. So that means that we can move towards native JavaScript, we can get better results, more performance without necessarily having to run jQuery. However, it also means that we need to be mindful of some code here. So there's two choices. We can either tell the code base to use the Optimizely jQuery, in which case we have to use the first one you see here, which is window.optimizely.get.jQuery, or we have to pick one of these, or we can tell it to use the website jQuery if one is present. And we have to pick. If we don't pick, we've got a problem. Or, ideally, use neither and just avoid jQuery altogether, which is always the preferred approach. Moral of the story is use utils, ES6, native JavaScript. They're the takeaways. Is anyone still writing campaign code in jQuery? Probably some of you. Toby, maybe a little bit, now and then. If we can avoid jQuery collectively, it's a good thing. So jQuery is pretty, and as probably any front-end developer on your team can attest to, it's, I guess you could say something that most modern front-end stacks are moving away from. Most modern websites are moving away from the idea of jQuery, moving towards native JavaScript. So where possible, for performance benefits, if you can go pure native JavaScript, much better. And the reason is otherwise we get ourselves into JavaScript hell. So we get in this maze. I don't know if any of you have ever done any stuff on Linux or Unix and found this situation where you've got dependency hell, where you've got this constant recursive loop between package A and package B. JavaScript hell is a bit like that, where you never get out of it and you're stuck. Just a reminder, asynchronous versus synchronous. It's important from a dev point of view. We won't labor that point. One issue that does come up a bit with Manny, and he pointed this out, and I think it's quite interesting and quite funny in some ways, is don't always believe what Google PageSpeed Insights tells you. So quite often he gets tickets from slightly confused Optimizely users who have run Google PageSpeed Insights over their website, and they've seen, for example, that a recommendation from Google, ironically, telling the website webmaster to basically de-render block or remove render block in JavaScript in Optimizely. If you actually follow these recommendations and did this as Google tells you to, it would actually kind of break Optimizely, which is kind of funny. So yeah. The document object model. So this is basically behind the scenes. Whenever we have a website, this is what actually goes on. So this is how Google Chrome or any other modern browser actually thinks about your website. So it's like a tree or a collection of elements. So we have the top level tree, which is the opening HTML tag, and then we have the properties of that tree. And we have the head and we have the body. So in this case, we've got the opening HTML tag, and it has a head and it has a meta and a link. Then we have the body of the page, the body of the website. And in the body of the website, we have a div, and we have a paragraph, and we have like some text that says, hello students web performance, or hello web performance students. This is important because fundamentally, everything we do in Optimizely and every other testing tool is all about manipulating this document object model. So what we're really doing is we're ultimately waiting for this to load in the browser, and then really, really fast, really quickly, we're switching out one particular component of this for something else. That's what testing is, ultimately, at a technical level. So the reason why this is important to understand is if we get this wrong and we don't visualize in our minds what the document object model is, and we don't actually think about this properly, and we're trying to, pull out the whole HTML block and replace that on the fly, then you're going to see flickering, whether you like it or not. So the moral of the story is make sure you have the right front-end developers involved. Alrighty, takeaways. So the good news is that there is a ton of expertise, optimizing solutions partners such as ourselves, many of whom are at the conference today. You would have heard talks from Conversion Kings, who are great, New Republic, who are great as well. There's also a ton of partners out there for Google Analytics certifications and audit. Manny and Holly are fantastic in terms of their ability to help with different technical issues, and they're on demand for support. There's also the Optiverse certification, training, all the above. There's a lot of stuff out there to help. And actually, I think, again, one of the reasons why Optimizely is a pretty good vendor in the space is, or our preferred vendor in the space, is that the amount of knowledge base and certification and training that's out there that's accessible versus like VWO or Target is much, much better. Also, Manny and Holly are pretty awesome. That's it.
Thanks, James. You went through that lightning fast. So we will have extra time. We will have some time for some questions. What I did want to mention is this probably highlights that we talk a lot about the strategy and the exciting parts of what experimentation can be, but as James delivered in really tough topics, this can be really hard sometimes, and that's the reality, right? Like, I wanted that to be part of some of this tough technical challenge, and we're often fighting for developer resources and saying we need them. You don't get them on the marketing side, but you can come back. These sessions are recorded. You can say, look, like this is a whole bunch of really technical aspect to things that we need to take into consideration, and we need the training. Whether that's having help from a partner or really leveraging what some of Optimizely has, like this is what makes or breaks whether experimentation in your conversion rate optimization program is really going to work or not. So sure. The recognition of that is super key to making optimization really successful in your organization. Happy to get into high-level strategy questions or anything specific about some of what James has mentioned. So I'll let him do the answering.
Any and all questions? Fire away. Or we can all just go drink beer.
How many of you learned something at least today, or is this, hands up, learned something? Awesome, thank you.
I learned something.
How many are really confused? Half of it for me, I was like, this is why I rely on you, James. So that's great, but it probably then says, wow, I have a lot to learn, or I need some identification of where I need the help. So really cool.
It is, yes, there's a lot to learn here, and a lot of the stuff we've only learned just by trial and error again and again and again and again and again through years of just mucking about with this stuff, to be honest.